Ukraine and European leaders have sent new peace proposals for the war in Ukraine to U.S. President Donald Trump. Loss of territory to Russia and use of frozen Russian assets in Ukraine remain areas of disagreement. But could the conflict be nearing an end? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Diplomatic activity between Washington and Europe is intensifying over the war in Ukraine. It's driven in no small part by the growing impatience of U.S. President Donald Trump for a peace deal. European leaders say a critical point has been reached after a call on Wednesday with Trump. He wants Ukraine to cede territory to Russia, a major political difficulty for President Volodymyr Zelenskyy after nearly 4 years of war. But fighting on risks alienating Trump, possibly threatening U.S. intelligence and other vital support. What happens to Russia's assets frozen in Europe is another point of contention. So, is an end to the war in sight? How can the divisions between all sides, Russia and Ukraine, Europe and the U.S., be overcome? And what happens if no agreement is reached? We'll speak to our guests shortly. First, this report from Alexandra Bias.
It's been a week of mounting pressure to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. On Monday, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy met the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany to hammer out a response to Washington's peace proposals.
Things which are very important for today, I think unity between Europe and Ukraine, and also unity between Europe, Ukraine, and the United States. There are some things which we can't manage without Americans, things which we can't manage without Europe, and that's why we need to make some important decisions.
On Wednesday, President Donald Trump held a phone call with the three European leaders.
And we discussed Ukraine in pretty strong words.
France, Britain, and Germany are calling it a critical moment for peace. Ukraine has concerns with the U.S. proposal. It wants security guarantees and doesn't want to cede territory to Russia. European allies are pushing Washington to revise the plan. But Trump says Zelenskyy has to be realistic.
Ukrainian people, they want to see a settlement be made. I understand that. They're losing thousands and thousands of people a week. They want to see it ended. So I think it's time to get that war settled. And I think it's a war that can be settled. But it takes two to tango.
The Europeans are hoping for more talks with the U.S. in the coming days. Russia says it sent its proposals for collective security guarantees to Washington, too.
We insist on reaching a package of agreements on solid, sustainable and long-term peace with guarantees of security for all the sides involved.
But far from the corridors of diplomacy, the war grinds on. Ukraine has attacked an oil refinery and a Russian-linked tanker in the Black Sea, while Russian troops are slowly advancing in southeastern Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin has warned Ukraine to withdraw completely from the Donbass region, saying Russia is determined to seize it and will use whatever force necessary to achieve its goals. Alexandra Bias, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guests. From Kyiv, we're joined by Peter Zalmayev, the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Chris Weafer is the CEO of Macro-Advisory, a strategic consultancy focused on Russia and Eurasia. He joins us from Moscow. And in Berlin is Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent for Europe at the New York Times. Thank you all for being on Inside Story. Peter Zalmayev in Kyiv, let me start with you. I understand you've been busy meeting with Ukrainian negotiators. What more can you tell us about these territorial concessions the Europeans have reportedly sent to the U.S.? President Zelenskyy had repeatedly rejected ceding land. What's changed? What concession is he prepared to make now?
I think the concessions that President Zelenskyy is ready to make is recognizing the reality on the ground, and that means stopping the war at the current front lines, stopping short of actually turning over additional land to the Russian side, which of course will not only be a tragedy for Ukraine, but it will probably be the very end of the world order as we know. This would be encouraging further aggressions in many parts of the world. That would mean essentially rewarding Russia for its aggression. I think also the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian government and the people now realize that for the foreseeable future, NATO membership is not feasible. So probably just also stopping short of officially making that claim, simply because it's part of the Ukrainian constitution, this aspiration for NATO. The reality should be, and will probably be recognized, that Ukraine will have to look for other security guarantees. But when it comes to those security guarantees, that is the big sticking point. I'm seeing this 20-point peace plan that is being now circulated, whittled out from the 28 points originally submitted, probably dictated by the Kremlin to the American side, and that also stops short of being satisfactory to the Ukrainian side.
Peter, we'll come back to the sticking points.
Convincing security guarantees there.
Yeah, we'll come back to the sticking points in a moment, but I just wanted to get a sense of the mood in Kyiv right now. Do you get a sense that we're now genuinely close to a deal and to an end to the conflict?
Well, the mood is, of course, I wouldn't say despondent, but it's, people are feeling disheartened, especially when the leader of the free world and up till now, Ukraine's biggest ally, is saying that Ukraine has no chance in this war. Literally a few weeks after he said that, in fact, Russia is making a fool of itself and it cannot win this war, and Ukraine has all the chance to win this war. So we have decidedly mixed messages from the American side. But when you ask me about the mood in Ukraine, well, the mood is such that whatever we've been offered is nothing short of a capitulation of Ukraine. So while it is difficult to continue this war, we're bleeding men. People are spending hours in darkness and cold in Ukraine. The alternative is to capitulate to Russia, which is essentially what this peace plan, as we've seen it, is.
Okay, Chris Weafer in Moscow, let me come to you next. Some Western officials have said in the past that President Putin shows no real sign of wanting peace. What is the mood music in Moscow right now? Is there appetite to see the war end there?
Yes, I think that the general feeling in Moscow is that at this time, the process of negotiations are a lot more serious. The fact that there has been very little public kind of commentary about the various proposals from the Kremlin or from the Kremlin's spokesperson, whereas previously there was a lot more openness, a lot more discussion about various previous peace proposals. That's not the case this time. There is kind of almost silence, which people are taking as an indication that there is more serious negotiations taking place. We are aware of a very kind of active shuttle diplomacy kind of taking place on a daily basis between senior officials in Moscow and those in Washington. So the process is definitely a lot more serious than we have previously seen. And there is an expectation that we are moving towards some sort of a deal, perhaps not in the next week or two, but in the next couple of months. That's definitely the mood in Moscow.
Okay, Stephen Erlanger, European leaders are definitely walking a tightrope here between backing Ukraine and keeping the US on board. How do you view this accelerated diplomatic push we've seen in the last few days? How close are we to a deal, you think?
I don't think we're that close. I think the Europeans are trying to slow it down a little bit. Trump is doing his old negotiating thing of trying to put pressure on Zelenskyy to capitulate quickly. The Europeans are saying to him, look, let's stick to our principles. The Europeans are trying to get the Americans and the Ukrainians and themselves in one room to hammer it all out, which so far the US hasn't really agreed to do. That may happen on Monday in Berlin. But the Europeans do, as you suggested, at the very top, they have a dilemma over these frozen Russian assets because the US would like to use them as part of the deal, giving some back to Russia and using them for American and Russian profit, while the Europeans want to use them to help Ukraine fund its government and its war. So that's going to come to something of a head next week when the European Council meets.
I'll come back to the Russian frozen assets in a moment. But Stephen, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, you say the Europeans are trying to slow it down. If that's the case, why are they talking about territorial concessions right now when Zelenskyy had clearly said that this was a red line for him?
Well, they're not really talking about territorial concessions. I mean, all they're talking about is stopping the war at the current lines. They're not talking about giving up the rest of the Donbass. And even to settle the war at current lines, they are insisting, as Ukraine is, on a seriously tough security assurance guarantee that includes American involvement. And so far, the Americans have been very reluctant to commit in any detail to that. So that is the sugar that may make the bitter pill of stopping the war where it is go down. But I see no European or Ukrainian at the moment being willing to hand over to the Russians the rest of the Donbass. Most experts think at this pace it would take Russia at least 2 years to conquer the rest of it. So there's pressure on both sides. There's no question. Russia's hurting, Ukraine's hurting.
Right.
Trump wants to get this done, but not at any price.
Okay, Peter, your thoughts about the territorial concessions, which seem to suggest that it would be about stopping the war at the current lines and not necessarily recognizing Russian sovereignty over some of the territory it occupies currently. Where does Ukraine stand on that? I mean, this would be what, a big ask for them, or would they accept this?
I think Ukrainians are the very justified opinion that Vladimir Putin will stop and really at no line. There's nowhere where he would stop short of conquering all of Ukraine. I mean, we go by the historical record of this. You remember when Putin, invaded the Crimea, and then he pledged not to, go further. And every stage of the way, Putin denies something, and then he turns around and does exactly that. If you listen to what his propagandists are saying, and his people surrounding him, including the former President Medvedev, they make it clear that all of control of all of Ukraine, outright, meaning the territory of Novorossiya, New Russia, which actually would encompass other oblasts, other regions such as Dnieper, Zaporizhia in their entirety. Odessa effectively locking Ukraine out of access to the sea, making it a landlocked country. That would be actually territory of Russia proper, written into its constitution, and the rest of the landlocked rump state of Ukraine would turn into a sort of Vichy Ukraine, which would be under the heel of Russia, would have no control over its foreign policy, would not be able to join NATO, and by definition probably would not be able to join the EU. That's something that would satisfy Vladimir Putin, and actually controlling the rest of the Donbass, those towns of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are actually, they've been turned into veritable fortresses in the last 10, 11 years. That would actually assist him in this sort of task. Those are very important commanding heights from which to continue gobbling up more Ukraine's territory. So I don't believe that any of these are workable simply because of Vladimir Putin's stated goals.
Yeah, let's ask Chris about this. Would stopping the war at the current lines, Chris, would it change Russia's strategic calculus?
Well, I think Moscow's stated position consistently over the last several years is that they want, a full and final agreement which guarantees security not for Ukraine, but also guarantees security for Russia. So whatever the deal is, the Kremlin's view is that it must be a final and robust deal. And that's important in terms of Russia's recovery, its ability to attract investors. Foreign companies are not going to come back to Russia, for example, if they view any deal as weak, or if there's a risk of an outbreak of war, in the near term or immediate future. So there has to be, I think that's accepted, there has to be a robust deal. Now, in terms of territory, we have heard this consistently from President Putin, is that Russia wants control of Donbass. And that appears to be, a critical issue, along with NATO membership and the return of frozen assets. Those are the three key issues.
Can I ask you about the frozen assets, Chris Weafer?
Yeah,
can I ask
sure.
you about the frozen assets? It is, that's one of the biggest unresolved issues, of course, right?
Yes.
From Moscow's perspective, is the release of any part of those assets a precondition for accepting a deal?
We haven't heard that stated in the same way as, for example, territorial control has been stated as a must-have. But the frozen assets issue, it's important, but there does appear to be some room for maneuver there. Where previously Russian officials have said that if some of the money could be used for investment, of course, but they want that investment to be in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the occupied territories. And it is kind of notable that the last time the World Bank produced a report talking about the cost of reconstruction in Ukraine, they did divide the numbers into reconstruction, if you like, in Western Ukraine and reconstruction in Eastern Ukraine. Okay. So there appears to be some talk about possibly allocating that money.
Chris, in the Moscow business, in the Moscow business community, do people believe those assets are ever coming back?
No. I think that the assumption is that those assets will be kind of either used for reconstruction in Ukraine, and as I mentioned, the Kremlin would want that in eastern Ukraine, in the occupied part. But no, nobody believes that the money is coming back. But frankly, that's not a critical issue. Russia's reserves have reached record high. They're about 730 billion. Whereas the amount that's frozen in the West is 300 billion. That money is just, if you like, a foundation for fiscal policy, monetary policy, etc. It's not money that matters for the economy in the sense of it's not money that would be used, for example, for investment recovery or for infrastructure, etc. It's just balance sheet money.
Let me ask Stephen his thoughts about that. I mean, Stephen, Chris says the assets are not a critical issue. From your reporting in European capitals, is the West treating these assets as leverage for a settlement or as a completely separate legal issue?
Well, I think Chris is right that Russia's pretty much written them off because even the G7 had said a long time ago that the assets would be used to reconstruct Ukraine. But the Russians have very cleverly, in their first proposals, the so-called 28 points, and currently now are trying to seduce Donald Trump and his government into using those assets for the benefit of the United States as well as for the benefit of Russia, while Europe very much wants to use them to help fund Ukraine for the next couple years. So that is one of the big differences. And also the US is pushing Ukraine and Europe to give up the Donbass. It is very much, in my reporting, taking Russia's side on this. And so, this is why I say I don't expect a deal very quickly, because whatever the US ends up with Europe and Ukraine proposing, Putin has a vote, and my guess is his vote will be, that's not enough, but let's talk about it, which could take quite a long time.
Okay. Peter Zalmayev in Kyiv, let me come to you and ask you about President Zelenskyy's position right now, his negotiating position. President Trump has increasingly framed him and presented him as the obstacle to peace. How has that rhetoric, as well as the corruption scandal he's been facing at home, how has that affected his position?
Well, it obviously hasn't done much to increase his popularity, but he did President Zelenskyy made that a crucial step in getting rid of Mr. Andriy Yermak, his all-time head of presidential office, and I would say a great cardinal of Ukrainian politics. So he did the minimum, and of course there's still much to be done as far as investigating the rest. But I think that Ukrainians are moving on, and so much so that of course all the attention is now on the peace process and the statements being made by Donald Trump, how this whole process is turning paradoxically into another Yalta, remember the Yalta conference after dividing the spoils of World War II, except that the paradox is that apparently the victor and in this war, Trump would say is Russia, or is inevitable. And so our ally, America, is actually, teaming up with our adversary to divide up Ukraine. I mean, this is what it's looking like, and this is a very absurd situation to be in.
And Zelenskyy
Yes.
has also been under pressure to hold elections. How feasible is that?
Yes.
To hold elections in 60 to 90 days? What conditions would make that legitimate?
Having this demand from the American president is also quite disheartening. It's not about Zelensky's will to hold or not to hold these elections. It's about security guarantees that we would need to hold elections in time of war. How would these hundreds of thousands of military men and women vote in this? Right? Who would provide the security guarantee? None of it is clear, and the Constitution does not grant Ukraine the right to hold elections at a time of war. And Donald Trump either does not know that, or he simply is not willing to consider this as a harsh reality. And so we're we've been pressed into this. And I think Zelenskyy made a smart move by saying, I'm willing to hold it, but give us the security guarantees. Give us, I don't know. It would probably take 1,000 Tomahawk missiles.
Stephen, your thoughts about those security guarantees. If NATO troops, as is suspected, NATO troops on Ukrainian soil are off the table for Germany and Italy, and the U.S. commitments are uncertain, as we're seeing, can any security guarantee be credible enough to stop a future Russian invasion?
Well, that's a very important question. I'm not sure I know the answer. Now, if there's a deal, if there's a settlement, Ukraine doesn't need anybody's permission to invite foreign troops onto its soil if it is a truly sovereign Ukraine. So Russia may not like it, but I don't think it will be able to stop it. The question is, if they're on Ukrainian soil, are they in danger? And if they're in danger, will the Americans come help them? This is unclear. I mean, the idea in general of the Coalition of the Willing is to keep supporting the Ukrainian army, which is very battle-tested and excellent and has 800 to 900,000 people. Compared to a British army of 70,000 people, it's enormous. And so the idea is to make Ukraine such a strong country in this peace period that Russia wouldn't try again, and then you would have foreign troops monitoring demilitarized zones, and you could use satellites, and the big question would be, if there is another Russian attack, or what would happen? And that's what these security guarantees are supposed to answer. I don't know what they're going to say. The Americans talk about these as Article 5-like guarantees, but that's an absurdity, because Article 5 either is or it isn't. There's nothing Article 5-like.
Right. And so your thoughts about that, Chris? Would an Article 5-like guarantee, as is being talked about, would that be viewed as an escalation by Moscow?
No. The Russian position is that there must be, from its perspective, a full and final and robust deal to end this war, a final deal. And assuming that is the case, they've said, then they're much less concerned about what security guarantees are given to Ukraine, because by definition, if there's a full and robust peace deal, then that should prevent any future conflicts.
But what is a full and robust peace deal for Russia?
Yeah, see, that's the problem. Yeah. That's exactly the good question. That's not clear. And we really won't know what is a full and final deal until we see it, until it's agreed. I mean, right now, obviously, the issue of territory is a big part of that. How would the peace process be monitored, etc. is a big part of it. All of these things are up there, and there's different proposals being kicked around. So there is no clear answer as to what a full and final deal looks like until we see it, unfortunately.
Peter Zalmayev, your thoughts. What would a durable, realistic peace framework look like? One that Ukraine, Russia, and Europe and the United States could all accept today?
Well, at this point, I'm not seeing a workable solution, to be quite honest with you. I'll just tell you what the peace deal will be that will be satisfactory to Russia, and I'll be very brief. The end of this war will mean the end of Ukraine for Putin. The minute a Russian soldier steps foot on the last square meter of Ukrainian territory out in the west, let's say the town of Uzhgorod, that will be the end of this war, which is to say that Vladimir Putin will stop at nothing. He's obsessed with this idea of controlling Ukraine, turning into a semblance of next-door Belarus, which, with no control over its foreign policy or other decisions, essentially a protectorate.
Okay, Stephen Erlanger, your thoughts. If the negotiated track breaks down, what happens?
Well, unfortunately, the war keeps dragging on. And the problem for the Europeans and for the Ukrainians is that, in the long run, Russia's bigger and it's more willing to sacrifice people. And so the long run is not good. I don't think Ukraine survives an endless war, but I think Ukraine is strong enough for the next year or so to resist Russia. I don't think it's about to break. Russian advances are increasing, but they're still very, very minor. And I'm not quite as pessimistic. I mean, I do think Putin would accept the so-called Ruski Mir part of Ukraine as his somehow, while leaving Western Ukraine, which was sort of Catholic Ukraine, as this rump state closer to Europe. But that is a very optimistic view, I have to say.
All right. And what about you, Chris? Do you have an optimistic or a pessimistic view here if these talks, the track of the talks fail?
Look, I think President Trump, well, we've of course all said it, his role is critical here, partly as a negotiator, but also Trump has made clear, and I guess by his behavior, that if he loses patience, then he could walk away from supporting Ukraine and withdraw military intelligence and perhaps equipment, which would then probably, strengthen Russia's position and accelerate their military gains. On the other hand, if he deems Russia to be at fault and blocking any peace deal, then he has already said that he could come with much more damaging and more extensive sanctions, which would have a big impact on the economy. And I think the Russians are very well aware of that and are very well aware of Trump's position. So I think that there is therefore an element of seriousness about these negotiations. I think the Russians do want a deal over the next couple of months because they don't want to take the risk of Trump, losing patience, blaming Moscow, and then coming with a significant raft of much more damaging sanctions, which would destroy the economy. I think the economy matters here.
All right. Peter Zalmayev in Kyiv, you have the final word. What options does Ukraine have left if the negotiations fail?
I think we have to, settle in for the long haul. We, have to reconsider the way we're doing mobilization. We have to be able to mobilize people, not just using a stick, but carrots. And for that, we need all of the European help we can get. We can't afford allies like Italy suddenly walking away and refusing to pay for Ukraine's armament. As the European leaders, one after another, have stated, Ukraine's defense is our collective security.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for a great discussion. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few days and next few weeks. Peter Zalmayev, Chris Weafer, Stephen Erlanger, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And, of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.